بس احنا قلوبنا مشغولة بحياتك بالدرجة الأولى، عايزينك تسمع وتصلي وصلاتك تصبح مقبولة، وتسلم للرب طريقك وتلاقي مشاكلك محلولة، في رسالة جاية لك من القلب، رسالة من القلب، رسالة من القلب.
Well, I decided to see, well, what exactly is the word trust? Well, according to gotquestions.org, and I liked what they said here, they said the word translated in the Bible, the word trust translated literally means a bold confidence and sure security or action based on that security. Trust is not exactly the same as faith, which is the gift of God, according to Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Rather, trusting is what we do because of our faith we have been given. Trusting is believing in the promises of God in all circumstances, even those where the evidence seems to be to the contrary. It's very easy to trust in God when all is well. How about when things aren't going so well? How's your trust in God then? Many people are given a bad news from a doctor, and they are told, sorry, there's nothing we can do to help you. Like, well, isn't there something you can do? And so we put our faith and trust in doctors, but at a certain point, doctors say that's all we can do. So what if we take it a step higher and say, well, who else do you turn to when, your financial planners and your doctors or your politicians fail you? So my question this morning and the theme this morning is, who do you trust? Some of you may say, I don't trust anybody. There are some people that walk around and say, I don't trust anybody but me. I have been hurt so many times and I've been failed so many times. I don't trust anybody but me. And you know what? A lot of times, by our actions, we do the same. We trust in ourselves before anyone or anything else. I would ask you to turn your Bibles to Daniel chapter 3. To the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 3. It's a familiar passage to many of us. When I was thinking of examples of in the Bible of trust, these three gentlemen came to mind. Now, of course, the name of the book is called Daniel, but in chapter 3, we are looking at three gentlemen who were companions and friends of Daniel, whose names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So first, some context. The empire of Babylon, in this particular book here in Daniel in the Old Testament, they expanded and they went and conquered lands as like the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. Well, this is during the Babylonian Empire, and they went into Jerusalem and attacked Jerusalem. And they took some of the captives, some of the Jews from there, and took them back to Babylon. And King Nebuchadnezzar said, well, I'm going to put some of these people to work under my administration, under my reign here. And so in chapter 1, Daniel and his companions were brought in under Nebuchadnezzar, and it's an amazing thing what happened. They were given the royal treatment. They said, we're going to train you, we're going to feed you with the king's food, and all these things that you might become one of us. And Daniel and his companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, said, no, we can't do that. And so in a familiar passage, they said, listen, just give us these foods, these vegetables to eat, and test us and see how well we look. And in chapter 1, if you just want to turn back there real quick. And so in verse 14, those that were in charge of Daniel and his companions said, he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better, and they were fatter and healthier than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice of food and their wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. And so if you look at verse 18, at the end of the days, the king had specified for presenting them. The commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king talked to them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, so they entered the king's personal service. And as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers and the wise men in all his realm. So here in chapter 1, we see that these men were elevated to a higher standing among all the other wise men and the learned men of Babylon. Well, things drastically change in chapter 3. We find out in verse 1 that King Nebuchadnezzar, he's the king, and he makes an image of gold, and it says here the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width was 6 cubits high, and set it up on a plain in Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, this would be, from my understanding from what I read, about 8 stories high. If you think of an office building, your average office building about 8 stories high. It was very tall and overlaid with gold. Now, this is in Babylon, modern-day Iraq, so you would think of the sun beating down and how shiny it would be and how it could be seen. And so he sets up this image here, and he says in verse 2 that he calls all his officials. It says satraps. These would be people that would be his representatives and prefects, military people, governors and counselors, treasurers, all the administrative people. He asks them to come at the dedication. There's this big dedication for this image, and he asks all of them to come. And so they do in fact come in verse 3. In verse 4, the herald, the one who would proclaim the announcements of the king, says, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. At the moment you hear the sound of the horn, and the flute, and the lyre, and the trigon, and the psaltery, and the bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up." So let's stop here for a minute. He goes into, it says, a plain area in the province of Babylon. So it's a flat area. So now this image is not going to be hidden by mountains or hills. It's in a flat area, so it'll be even more prominent and easily seen. It's overlaid with gold, so it's very shiny and it's very tall. It's hard to miss. But just in case, for some reason, you happen to not see it or you're indoors, he says, we're going to set up an orchestra. And I love music and everything, but this is kind of a twisted way to use the orchestra here. He says, the orchestra is going to play, and at the sound of the music, you are to fall down at this image. Now, maybe some of the people said, okay, this king is a little unusual. Fine, we'll do this. We'll fall down. But he doesn't stop there. We'll see that this is just not a political surrendering to the wishes of King Nebuchadnezzar, because he says to fall down and do something else. He says to fall down and worship. I don't know if he's instilling a new god. It doesn't tell us what this image is, if it's of him or another god or of their time or a god that he created. But he did want them to fall down, acknowledge it, and to worship this image. And he says, whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. So there it is. You either do this, kneel down and worship this image, or you die. There's no trial. There's no, 8 years on trial. It's an immediate death sentence. You will be cast into the furnace of blazing fire. And so in verse 7 it says, at that time when the peoples heard the music, and it names all the instruments, you can imagine how loud it is with all these instruments playing, that the people of every language, because remember the Babylonians would go conquer these various cultures and people groups, and they would come back and they would be speaking the different languages. So it says, nations and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. That's what he wished for. Except there were some people that would not do that. These same men that we saw in chapter 1 that would refuse the king's food refused to bow down and worship. We know that because there was people that were actually, it seems like if they were watching them or spying on them. It says here in verse 8 that Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against these Jews and responded and said to the king, "O king, live forever. You king, you made a decree, or you made a law that every man who hears the sound of all these instruments of all kind, they are to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into this blazing furnace of fire." And they said, and if you're in elementary school or you're a teacher, this is called tattletale. They're tattling. Or at home, they're saying, they're snitching. They're saying what their brother or sister didn't do or their friends. Well, they are saying, "We know of some people, O king, live forever, who are not doing this." In verse 12 it says, "Namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up." So notice the way they phrase this, which is they have insulted you. They have disregarded your command. They don't worship your gods, and they don't worship the image that you set up. Now, I'm sure they knew the consequences. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, I'm sure because they were in the administration officials, they knew the consequences. But yet they still chose not to worship. In verse 13, this sent Nebuchadnezzar into a rage and anger and gave orders for them to be brought before him, and these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up?" He wants to know. He heard the report, and remember, he knows these guys. So he gives them a second chance. He gives them a second chance. He says, "Okay, listen. Maybe you didn't get the message. So I'm giving you an opportunity." So in verse 15 he says, "Now if you're ready at the moment, we'll play the music. You will fall down and worship the image that I have made, and all will be well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" King Nebuchadnezzar is almost exalting himself over any possible god. He's saying, you have a second opportunity now to spare your life. We'll play the music, but God help you. Oh, he said, no God can help you. There isn't a God that can help you out of my wrath and in my hands. So, what do? As I said earlier, it's really easy to put your trust when things are going well, but how about when things are not going so well? So, as I said earlier, what happens to your faith when it's tested? When the waters are calm, it's real easy to trust in God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were now getting put through the fire. They were going through the rough waters, if you will. They were living a nice life within the administration, but now their lives are at stake. And King Nebuchadnezzar says, you will worship this image or you will die. And it won't be an easy death. You will burn alive. Who will deliver you out of my hands? What God is there? Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had faith and trust in a God. And in verse 16, they replied to the king and they said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." Can you imagine the insult? when he just said, what God is there that can deliver you out of my hands? And they said, we have trust and faith in a God who will deliver us out of your hand. Nobody talks to the king like that. And in verse 18, they say something even more amazing. Even if he does not, and what they mean by that is, even if he does not spare our lives, if God allows us to burn, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship that golden image that you have set up. Their trust in God is so strong that they said he is able to do what is almost unthinkable, impossible, to deliver us out of this fire. But our trust in God is so great that even if he does not, if it costs us our life, we will not worship your image and bow down to your image. We will still trust in him. You know, on our coins and in our dollars here in America, it has the phrase, "In God we trust." That's a real nice motto. It's very nice to say. But can you live it out? I asked the question earlier and I ask it again today. Who or what do you trust in? These gentlemen said, our trust is in God, even if it costs us our life. Well, Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath. He was enraged by this. It says in verse 19, the expression on his face changed. His face contorted with rage. You can imagine how angry he is after being insulted like this and refused by these gentlemen. And he answered by giving orders not just to burn them, but to turn up the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He wants to incinerate them like nothing else. And so they were tied up. He brought in some strong men and tied them up with their clothes on and threw them into the fire. The king in verse 22, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace had remained extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It seems as if this was a large furnace and that they would throw the fuel from up top. And so it says they carried men up top and they threw them down. I guess when they opened up the hatch or whatever it was, that the heat killed the men that threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into this flame. And it seems as if there's an open area below that he could see. And the king looks inside there. In verse 23 it says, the 3 men fell into the midst of the furnace, still tied up. And Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. You can imagine he's sitting down looking this, waiting for their screams, and he stands up and he's looking at them and he says, was it not 3 men we cast bound into the midst of the fire? And they replied to the king, certainly, O king, it was 3 gentlemen. He said, look, I see 4 men loosed walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. Amen, indeed. Who was there in the midst of the fire? There's a big word in theologians might sometimes use called the theophany, which basically is an appearance of God. If you look in the Old Testament, there's many references to the angel of God or this person who looks like the Son of God. Is this the Lord Jesus Christ there in the midst of the flame before he even came and was born and lived among us? King Nebuchadnezzar said, this 4th person is like an angel. He said, like a son of the gods, not a normal person. And he goes to the entrance of the door and he calls them out and says, come out here, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the highest God, of the God of most high God. Come here. He acknowledges that there might be other gods that they worship, but there is none like this God. This God is of the highest. And they came out of the midst of the fire, and all the administrators that saw this, in verse 27, it says that the fire had no effect on their bodies of these men, nor was the hair of their heads singed, nor was their clothes or their trousers damaged. Not even the smell of fire was on their clothes. They didn't even smell like smoke. And King Nebuchadnezzar is forced to acknowledge that there is a God that can deliver them out of their hands. And he says with his own mouth, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who put their" what? Their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as to not serve or worship any god except their own God. Who do you trust? You may say, I trust my bank account. I trust my money. You see, I don't trust people, but I trust in things that can get me satisfaction or safety. It doesn't work that way. You can lose your funds. You may keep your money and still won't buy you life. We see here that these gentlemen said, if it costs us our life, we will trust in our God. As has been mentioned many times, we're entering a very tumultuous year, or we've been in a tumultuous year. We're going into an election. Folks, our trust is in God. We trust him no matter who is president, who our senators or our Congress might be, our city council. Our trust is in God. If you notice this, that their testimony of trust affected those that were around. It affected the king and those that were there that saw this. Nebuchadnezzar had everything. He had authority, he had wealth, he had a great name. He still wasn't satisfied. He had all those things, he was not satisfied. He had a void in his life. In Matthew 26:24-26, Jesus says to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? I'd like to ask this question. When doctors aren't able to help you and financial people can't help you and you can't help yourself, who do you trust? And I pray that you would say you have a trust in God. And if you don't, I pray this morning that you would realize that without a trust in God, there is no hope. We can set up our own idols, just like King Nebuchadnezzar. We can set up ourselves. If you look at our social media pages, we kind of portray this image of who we are or what we want to be. Maybe we set up idols of sports heroes or politicians or musicians or whoever it might be, and we kind of idolize and worship these people. Or we want people to idolize us. It's fleeting. I ask, who do you trust? These leaders were keeping an eye on these three men. And likewise, as Christians, people are looking at us, and one of the biggest criticisms of Christians is that, they're hypocrites. But notice the testimony that they left because of their trust. I think of people like here in this church who went through great suffering. Auntie died. And the testimony of trust that she had with her doctors. And what a testimony that was to all those that witnessed it and saw her. And likewise, we can have a testimony of our trust in God. These three men knew their God and trusted his omnipotence and sovereignty. Notice this, because they knew their God, they were able to be so bold. And I pray that each and every day that we would know our God a little bit more. That we would trust him a little bit more, that we would have this kind of trust and faith. And even while trusting God, they allowed for the possibility that they might burn. They said, even if we are not delivered from this fire, we will still trust in him. So I pray that you may say, yeah, I have trust in God, but it's not like it was because things are going rough in my life. Job, in the book of Job, when he was tormented and full anguish, and his wife said, why don't you just curse God and die? He said, no. Do we not expect good and bad things in life? And I will still bless the name of the Lord even during these times. And he said, even if he slay me, yet will I trust in him. My dear friends that are watching and here, and those that are watching via the internet, I hope and pray that you would put your trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. On this first Sunday of the month, we normally would have communion. Because of the COVID, we're not, but we are celebrating his death, burial, and resurrection from the cross. And Jesus says, I am the way. And maybe you're asking, how do I get to heaven? And it's through Jesus. And I pray that you would put your faith and trust in him. If you would call the number at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions, or if you need a Bible or just prayer, if you're going through some rough times and you say, I have faith, but I'm really going through some very difficult times. If you would call that number, that you might find encouragement. And I pray that you would know Jesus as the one, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who was with you in the midst of the fire. Would you pray with me?
Not a burden we bear, not a sorrow we share, but our toil does quickly repay. Not a grief nor a loss, not a frown or a cross, but is blessed if we trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. But we never can prove the delights of his love until all on the altar we lay. For the favor he shows and the joy he bestows are for them who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet we will sit at his feet, or we'll walk by his side in the way. While we said we will do, where he sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey.